Hello, my name is Jennifer Liang, and today I welcome you to this presentation. I'm going to talk to you about health inequities and what happens to people's health and well-being following conflicts. This study is part of a larger Closing the Gap for Health Equity study here in India. And this was done it was for 1.5 years. So it was done between March 2016 and September 2017. So the whole presentation, I'll just give you a brief idea. So in this condensed slide, I've just put this down. So I'll just give you a very brief background about conflict and what's happening to conflict and health studies and where the gaps are. And I'll also give you a little background about the study area where this was done. Then very briefly, I'll give you the methodology we followed. This is a qualitative, in-depth qualitative study, and I'll talk about that. And then we'll go directly into what we found in this study. And this will be, again, I'll be talking in 4 different parts. And each of these actually correspond to the research question which we had. We'll go to conclusion and then we'll have a Q&A. So basically, if you come to this slide on conflict and health, conflicts are already a reality for many in the world today. And it's already a major cause of death and ill health. I mean, it is estimated that 25% of the world already live in what is called as FCAS areas, that's fragile and conflict affected states. And alarmingly, this is expected to double by 2030. And conflicts already, there's a study by Moyes, and it says that it's already the top 10 causes of death in 40 countries in the world today. And WHO says that by 2020, conflict will be the 8th leading cause of death. So many people in the world are already living with conflict, and their health and well-being are being affected. Secondly, if you look at, it's a major driver of health inequities already. Many studies again in that. And in Africa, in Congo areas, the IRC says that, mortality rate is 2 to 3 times more than in non-conflict areas. In countries where conflict is there, the health expenditure is just 2% compared to 4.7% in non-conflict areas. There's a huge development gap between warring, non-warring countries. You look at any of the indicators, development indicators, they're almost 30 years behind in GDP growth rate, and they're 20 percent points lesser in overcoming poverty. So conflict is a major driver of health inequities. Thirdly, the effects of conflict is actually very, very deep, and not just deep, it is in many, many different dimensions. So it's multiple and multi-layered. If you look at, it's physical, it's psychological, it's social, and these are just the direct effects. If you look at the indirect effects, there are huge. Loss of livelihoods, nutrition, health systems are destroyed. There's continued insecurity for a long time. And the damage to the health infrastructure system, transportation, communication, all this has huge effects on health. Then another point is, these are the direct effects of conflict on people, but there are also displacements which happen. So forced displacement, our study also talks a lot of that, but one sees huge negative health consequences. People are forced to just focus on survival, and various systems of agriculture, health, social services, law and order, a lot of things are destroyed, and when people get displaced. Then the last thing that we looked at, and a lot of literature also has focused on children and women and how they are affected by conflict. I mean, consistently we see that women and children are disproportionately affected and negatively affected. In Africa, they say 1 in 16 women die compared to 1 in 3,800 in developed countries. There's a higher fertility rate due to higher insecurity. The psychological stress, the brutality on women, Uh, Erdl and Che 2013, many studies again around that. Uh, then there's a lot of studies again to show how child mortality is very high in conflict areas because of malnutrition, infectious diseases, poor immunization. Um, in the Ugandan war, they saw that child mortality was almost 600 per thousand. This is by Z and others in 2006. Uh, so, therefore, the effect of conflict on women and children is very, very high. So, therefore, we saw that, conflict today is already a reality for many in the world, and that's why there's a need. But there are still some gaps in literature. Yeah, that's why this study was also conducted. Uh, Violence and conflict, we see that it's not getting enough attention from public health research and policy. It's not seen to be a public health problem as such. So therefore, there's no health focused, very little public health research on it. Where the research is done, it tends to be on the emergency and when it's happening, when the conflict is happening. Very few studies on the long-term impact of conflict on health. Uh, and also like long drawn conflicts, which is a reality for many of the conflicts in the world. uh, Low intensity conflicts, they may not be very very intense wars, but constantly there is this conflict which underlies many communities. Repetitive conflicts, again, we don't have much study around that. And India does not even recognize conflicts within its boundaries, you know. So therefore, it's very difficult to do studies around that, and it gets controversial at times, and the findings are not, accepted very easily. And there are even fewer studies on the Northeast. Yeah. So in the Northeast, what we find is that if you look at the literature, there's a lot of assessment of the emergency situation, but there are few or there are almost no studies on the long-term health risk and vulnerabilities of people living in conflict areas. We don't know how people live in these areas, how they cope, how these conflicts have affected their lives, their health, their well-being. So Northeast is a big, large dark hole where research on health impact of conflict is concerned. Um, and then lastly, also literature, it does not tell you too much about the differential effects of chronic conflict on health. So how does long-term conflict affect the health and well-being of women, children, and different ethnic groups? Everybody is just clubbed together into one and seem to be victims of conflict, but we don't really understand the nuances around it. So because of all this, then we decided to look at conflict in one area. So if you look at, go to the next slide. If you look at our area of study, uh, it's done in Assam, and the area that we focused on in this little place called Deosri in the Chirang district of Assam. Now, Chirang is one of the 4 districts of Bodoland, which is in western part of Assam, and the area where we focus is bang on the Bhutan border. And if you know a little bit about, so it's been affected by both by militant conflict and also many waves of ethnic conflict over 20-25 years. So the study actually focuses on this one area and around villages in that. And we looked at actually a long span of history and people who've been affected by conflict in different time spaces around this 20-25 years. The study area, the villages that you can see, it is a highly, it's remote, it's marginalized an area. It's, I told you, right on the Bhutan border. And if you look at some of the photos over here, this is taken, during the study. And people do live in very marginalized conditions. And these are people who've been displaced, affected by conflict, some of them even like by 3 or 4 times by conflict. So it is a highly marginalized area. it is a forest area that they live in. So these are all actually forest villages, and people have been displaced on that. Livelihoods is a struggle for many people in this area. So we'll talk more of that and how that is linked to conflict. Go to the next slide. I'll just talk a little bit about the research methodology. As I mentioned earlier, this does follow an in-depth qualitative research methodology. It's been done in the course of almost 1.5 years, very in-depth with ethnographic elements. So the data collection methods that we've used is in-depth individual interviews. We use a lot of biographies, case histories, stories of people, life stories, group interviews, and observations. So a lot of these are also then very ethnographic in nature. So we set up a field camp actually in the area from June 2016 to January 2017. All the researchers, we stayed in the field, and one advantage which we had is that this study was done, we all part of this NGO called the ANT, which has worked here for almost 8 to 10 years. I mean, this organization has been working here. So therefore, it was easier for us to get access to people, and because conflict and conflict affected areas is not an easy area to get access to. And people are very mistrustful of outsiders, and this is a very sensitive topic. So to talk of trauma and what they've undergone, so it's not an easy area. But because we had access to people, and we knew the area well, we had worked here for many years, that's why we could get this kind of an access, this deep access. Most of the interviews we tried to tape record it wherever it was possible, and these were transcribed, and where it was not possible to tape recorded, we've kept date wise field notes, very detailed field notes were kept. We had a number of small talks, informant interviews, of observations, so these we could not possibly tape record. So we've kept detailed notes of these, and photographs were taken wherever and with permission of the people. One defining feature of this whole methodology was that we kept doing the data analysis as and when we were collecting it. So team meetings were held, and the whole research team would sit together and discuss on what is happening, and then accordingly again we would go back to the field and fill in the data gaps. So this kept going on. The presentation of it is that we've used a lot of timelines and conceptual maps, diagrams to fill in all this. So I'll just show you some of that as and when we do. Coming to the questions of research or objectives, we had 4 of them, and the presentations of the findings are also based on these 4 objectives. So firstly, we wanted to look at, historically what has happened in terms of conflict and how has it affected the health system. So how has the socio-political changes, historically affected the health system, and vice versa. Does lack of health contribute to conflict in any way? The second one we tried to look at was how does it affect different groups, different ethnic groups differentially. And the second part of it was the critical social determinants and the loss of that, like livelihoods, land, housing, culture, safety, security, community. How does it all mediate to create ill health? The third one is how do people cope? So, and how do people, different types of people, different groups of people, individuals, gender, class, ethnicity, religion, do these different types, groups of people, how do they cope with ill health in a conflict area? And the last part of it was we tried to look at what's the role of the government and government health services, health promoting institutions like PDS, ICDS, water, sanitation, midday meal. Do these work or not, and how do they promote people's health? So based on that, I'll go through each one of these, but in the chapters. So the first chapter that we looked at was conflict and the public health system. What happens to it? Um, so if you look at main findings, it was very interesting that in this area that we did the study in, there was a functioning health system till the 1990s. But the years of militancy and repeated bouts of ethnic conflict, there were 3 bouts of ethnic conflict, it's kind of worn it out. Yeah, and then the second thing that we see that it's not actually the government, but the private players. In the absence of the government, some private players, NGOs, traditional healers, we have non-qualified pharmacists who actually fill this gap, of health services. When the public health services were completely absent, collapsed, these were the people who filled it in. The third one that we see that even now, in 2005, 2005, 8, when NRHM actually came in, the physical infrastructure kind of improved, but getting health personnel is a huge challenge till date. And a large part of it is also, as it is difficult to get health personnel in remote rural areas. But the negative perception about lawlessness and insecurity really, makes people very, very hesitant to come to these areas and serve. Uh, the last part is that, there is still, even today, very, very poor quality of healthcare, especially because of the lack of qualified doctors in the government hospitals. So these were some of the things that we found. I just wanted to show you this part of it, what we did with the data. Uh, we drew something called a conflict timeline of Bodoland. This area is in Bodoland. I told you it's part of the 4 districts. And Bodoland has been undergoing a lot of militant conflicts from late 1980s and till date. Today we are in a post conflict, you can say, kind of a situation. But for almost 20-25 years there's been militant conflict interspersed with ethnic conflict. So we've had many rounds of ethnic conflict, and this area where the study was done, we was directly affected by 3 rounds of ethnic conflict. And if you go to the next slide, what we did was we took one state dispensary. A PHC is called a state dispensary in Assam. And so we took one government PHC called Shantipur, and we looked at the timeline of that. And it's really interesting when you study it, with the conflict timeline, because, you know, if you see that, one can easily see that in the 1970s and 80s, there was a functioning health system. There were doctors, and in fact there were 11 doctors in this whole area. Um, and then as and when the conflict increases, doctors flee, and health personnel flee, and no outsiders are coming in, and there are only local doctors. Even for them it's very, very difficult to function, because the system then starts collapsing. And slowly, if you look at, in the 1990s, there's a complete collapse. So then when conflict actually happens in 1996, 1998, the collapse is so much that they are not even able to give emergency services. And so this keeps happening, and other players then step in. And so even in, like, if you look at in 2000, late 2008, 2010, NRHM comes in, but still there's no qualified doctor and Ayurvedic doctors there. And that also is not able to function very well. So then this keeps happening as part of it. So we did this conflict timeline to really see what happens in a conflict. And we've done interviews with doctors over the 25 years of the conflict, and who were part of the health system and now are not there anymore. Some who are still there in the health system. So we've interviewed them. We've interviewed people outside of this area also to see the comparison. And there is a definite, decline in health, public health system with conflict. Yeah, so that we can very definitely see. Then we come to the next, if you come to chapter 3.2, this is one of our largest and biggest chapters, and the meat of our study as such is here. If you look at, like, we've seen that the poor and marginalized, this is an area which is already very marginalized, an area where people are vulnerable, but what we find is that they actually push to the edge after an episode of conflict. They're already poor and gets poorer. There's reduced resources, causes ill health and deaths. A number of our cases we found that just ordinary life challenges, they become catastrophes. So illnesses that one would actually take in the course of, one would happen to people in the course of ordinary life, it becomes health catastrophes. Second thing that we see that it's not a very simple kind of a loss. There's a complex web of losses at many levels: physical, economic, social, psychological, ecological. So that comes out very clearly in a number of the life histories of people that we have studied, whether they've been affected like now, recently, by the 2014 conflict, or even by 1996 conflict, 1998 conflict. So there is a huge and complex web of losses. So I'll just show you a part of that and some examples of that. Uh, then we also see that, the risk factors of becoming ill and ill health, it persists long after the violence episode is over. We tend to think of conflict as only that episode of violence, and after that we feel that people bounce back, they go back, but it doesn't happen like that. I'll show you that again, an example of that. Vulnerable populations of women, young girls and children, again, I've spoken about that even in the literature review that we did. We saw a lot of that, and here the study bears it out. And not just the people who are directly affected, but host populations, their lives also get disrupted. Yeah. So I'll very quickly go through some of what we've done. If you look at this figure in this slide, I've just shown you the displacement map, how populations get displaced. I mean, from one place they move to another, and from there the other population actually gets displaced. And people move from place to place, camp to camp, camp to camp, till they kind of settle, whatever you call settling. And what is surprising is that even 20-25 years down the line, there's not been real rehabilitation of people. So I've shown you some photographs over here. The next slide that I want to show you talks about the vulnerability map. I've constructed this vulnerability map to actually show this is the life history of just one single family. It's a Bodo family, and they were affected in the recent 2014 ethnic conflict between Bodos and Adivasis. And you just look at the kind of multiple and multi-layered effects of conflict. I'll just take you to this one last part of it. So this lady, if you look at, there's this, if you look at to the right hand side, there's this obstetric emergency. So she was 9 months pregnant, and she had to rush to the hospital. But what was really ironic was that she had to send her young daughter away to work as a maid servant, and increase the risk of the girl getting abused, maybe even trafficked. And with that money, she actually could take care of her own delivery of her new baby. So so the mother's vulnerability was I mean, the daughter's vulnerability actually helped reduce the risk factors of the mother. So I mean, these are kind of situations, and you look at all this, I mean, so this is a multi-layered, again, very deep kind of vulnerabilities this family has suffered from this one episode of conflict. Yeah. The second slide that I'll show you is, again, this is another case. The names have been changed of all the respondents. Again, this is one lady, and if you look at the risk factors, before the conflict, and I was trying to show you risk factors after the conflict. So from 2 risk factors, of ill health before the conflict, it goes to 11 risk factors that she has suffered. And protective factors, she had many protective factors before the conflict. Husband being alive, the home was near the road, and availability of livelihoods. I mean, if you just look at some of these protective factors which prevent people from becoming ill, and you look at that, that's decrease. So this is a direct effect of conflict and displacement. This person, so the protective factors have decreased while the risk factors of ill health has increased disproportionately. Yeah. Then so I just want to also show you, then, within the households, women, young adolescent girls, and children, these are the groups which are very, very badly affected because of conflict. Conflict, it affects the entire family, but within that, I mean, we have women, I mean, who tell us about the kind of stress that they suffer, and even now the kind of aches, pains that they undergo because of the conflict that's happened. And this seems to be intergenerational. I mean, I'll just come to that a little later. Young adolescent girls, I've just said that, they lose school when you're displaced. You lose your schooling, and because of which, again, impoverishment, there's no food. And so girls are sent out to work as maidservants in people's homes. And, cases of abuse, sexual abuse, uh, trafficking increases hugely. Again, with children, I mean, children, they are the youngest survivors of conflict. So we've had a number of cases where children have been telling us about how they lost their education. We've seen a lot of women have, a large number of miscarriages and spontaneous abortions after, displacement while they're in the camp. So in our study, we focus both, the experiences of being in the camp, and also, moving out of it and what happens to that. In this part, we'll just look at, then, in this kind of a situation, how do people cope? So after a conflict, when they're so vulnerable, how do they cope, and what is health seeking? So some of our main findings is that, in the absence of a functional public health system, I showed you that there was a complete collapse of it. So dependence on informal healthcare providers are very, very high. So in all the communities that we studied, whether it was the Bodos or the Adivasi or the Nepalis in that area, Nepalis are the host population, they use a mix of treatment services. And what is really interesting is, it's not so much as the culture or tradition of people, as the choice actually depends on affordability and level of affluence. So you choose the kind of service depending on whether you have the money for it. So the Adivasis delay in seeking modern allopathic treatment for most illnesses because of poverty. So we'll just show you some examples of that. And the poverty due to the conflict inflicted losses and an irresponsible public health system, it creates health catastrophes. I spoke about that even earlier, but we see that small health incidents become catastrophes for families who have been affected by conflict. So the treatment of facilities available, if you look at, there are 4 types that we found. Traditional healers, there are pharmacies, which are actually unqualified practitioners of modern medicine. NGOs stepped in, when there was a complete collapse of the health system. And the government hospitals that people now also visit. So these are the 4 things that are available to people. What we did was, we mapped out the entire matrix of where the health services are for these 7 villages that we had studied. And it ranges, the distance ranges from 3.5 to 1 kilometer to almost 12 kilometers distance. And most of the people use the dispensary that we had earlier spoken about, which is non-functional even now. So that the timeline and the life history of the dispensary that we looked at, I mean, that dispensary is what most people are using. Otherwise, so that's about the government health system. But otherwise, people use whatever is available to them, largely like traditional healers and also pharmacies. So we followed actually traditional healers to see what kind of people use them and for what. And again, very, very interesting. I mean, I'll just show you this, that, traditional healers not just heal physically, but also psychologically, mentally, and spiritually. So it's hugely preferred by people. They are affordable, and yeah. This is a photo of one of the pharmacies, a very popular one. And if you look at what people are saying, I mean, they are saying that, we hesitate to go to the Shantipur hospital because it is too expensive. This is a government hospital that they're talking about, which is supposed to be free. And besides, the doctor just writes the name of medicines on a slip and sends us to the pharmacy. So we might as well go to the pharmacy straight away. Why go to the hospital? So if you look at the pharmacy, it's actually just a tin shed, and but that's what is available to people. We also looked at treatment-seeking pathways, and 2 Bodo children. So the same vulnerable family, the vulnerability map that we showed you earlier, this is the children from that same. If you look at the parents actually tried a lot, and after the displacement, that's when the children fell sick. It could be because of poor nutrition, housing. They were living in basically a plastic roof over their head, and then they moved to an area which is deep inside the forest. So then children must have fallen sick. But they tried a number of things, went to the government hospital, tried to borrow money, and takes to a bigger Catholic hospital. Again, a hospital sends them away, and they keep trying, and 2 of the children die in this. So there is it's a huge desperate situation actually for people. Similarly, in the next one, we tried to show how an Adivasi girl, she's 17 years old and she's pregnant when they leave the camp. This is after the 2014 conflict. And, again, the family is very, very desperate situation, and how they keep trying to get help. And finally, she dies in the 8th month of pregnancy. And this is linked directly to impoverishment after the conflict and the lack of healthcare services. So so we're trying to show you that, again, people's ill health, well-being is highly compromised, health and well-being is highly compromised following conflict. In the last chapter, this is a very, very short chapter actually, because there's not much of, any effective health. So one really sees over here, if you look at the findings, governance is very, very poor. And it's not just poor, I mean, there's a complete lack of care for people following conflict. And in an area which is already so vulnerable, where the government should be actually focusing more of its resources, energy, time, we see that it's just not available. Essential services are not there. Government accountability is very, very low. And, one of the excuses that they give, that these are forest encroachers. So because they're forest encroachers, they say that it's an excuse for not providing services. People are actually left to survive or perish, on their own. So if emergency happens during the time that they're in the camp, there is some ration coming and some government services coming, healthcare, doctors come. But after that, then you're just left on your own. So, we have a national relief and rehab policy does not mention conflict-induced displacement at all. The Assam State Disaster Management Authority focuses only on natural disasters. There's hardly a mention of conflict affected populations and what happens to them. Uh, we did a matrix, if you look at, of the government facilities available in the villages of study. Again, you look at ICDS is defunct. Okay, government primary schools in some villages there are there, but many villages is not there. Midday meal, again regular in some, irregular in many. Piped water is absent completely. Latrines is completely absent except in the Nepali Basti, which is a host population, not really directly affected. NREGA job cards, again, very few. And where there are job cards also, there are no jobs. Yeah, and distance from the health facility, you can see, is pretty high. So these are some of the photos of the current places where people live. Yeah. So in the end, in the last part or last slide, that I want to say that we need to look at the ways in which we really work with people following conflict. I mean, conflict has to be as a public health issue. Yeah, and conflict response also has to be a public health issue. We cannot just leave it as disaster response. But move beyond the knee-jerk reactions to conflict. We need multi-agency, multi-layer, deep and long-term strategies. You have seen that it is so deep, the vulnerabilities that people suffer. So we cannot just have, working in silos, but have very, very deep and long-term strategies if we have to help people move out from their state of vulnerability after a conflict. The health services has to move beyond relief camps. I've been saying again and again. I mean, why can't we think of mobile services, doorstep health services? Yeah. And I think one very important thing is shift in the government's attitude to acknowledge the presence of conflict displaced populations and work to reduce their vulnerabilities in the long term. Not just focus on when they're in the camp, and once they're out of the camp, it's out of sight, out of mind. I mean, that's the sad state of affairs right now. And when people have suffered, this deep trauma, I mean, we have to give special focus on quality health centers and health personnel working in fragile conflict affected. We have to look at how you counter the negative perception of conflict. Yeah. And get people involve the community, have campaigns, for improving the functioning of health centers. Reach out to people in medical colleges and talk to them, offer some kind of help. You have to offer special concessions. You have to offer special packages to people to come and work in these areas. Lastly, I want to say that focus on reducing vulnerabilities of women, younger children, girls. We have to look at long-term delivery of health promoting services. I mean, these things, ICDS, PDS, midday meal, water, sanitation, they were not there even before the conflict. And after the conflict, they become absolutely essential because people are already made so vulnerable. And a small event can again make it into a catastrophe. So therefore, let's look at how you reduce vulnerabilities in the long run. So yeah, so these were some of the things that we looked at, and yeah, I'll be happy to answer any questions if you have. Thank you so much for listening.